the big job of the criminals is to keep the truth from the people. They want, not only do they want you not to find out anything, but they flood you with disinformation. Most of the stuff that you get in the press is absolute lies, and if it's not lies, it's spin or distortions. In other words, they give you 10% of the truth, and the rest is all distortions, and they demonize people so that you're filled with anger against the Holocaust people who murdered all the Jews in Germany, and and people do get very angry because of these things, and they don't even know what they're angry about because they're not told the facts, and never will be told the facts because the press is totally in the hands of the bankers, because news is a high-budget, capital-intensive operation. You need a lot of money. You need a staff covering the whole world, and it's a very expensive situation. So the average truth seeker is not going to start his own television station or newspaper because he doesn't have the $100 million that you need to even get it off the ground. So we're reduced to meetings like this, which are very good. And we also, God apparently was merciful on us, and he gave us the internet. Because in fact, in the States, we had this total monopoly of television by 3 television networks, which were all controlled by Zionists. And so along came cable, and suddenly we had all new stations and all sorts of controversial programs coming on, which of course the 3 Zionist networks would not touch with a 10-foot pole. And the result was they were left behind. They had 100% of the television audience, they now have 30%, and it's dropping every year. In fact, it's probably less than 30%, but they're cooking the books in order to maintain their advertising revenues to give a totally false picture of their audience, which is probably less than half of what they claim, because that's how they keep up their television revenues, based on audience share. So this is all a banker's operation, and I was telling you about the fact that the bankers met in Jekyll Island in 1910, and who was the chairman of this meeting? The chairman of this secret meeting was Senator Nelson Aldrich, the Republican majority leader of the Senate. And of course, the Republican Party was in full power at that time because after the Civil War, the corporations and banks moved in and took over everything. And they made money so fast that they didn't know what to do with it. And they owned all the railroads and the corporations, and the profits rolled in. And in fact, they were making so much money that they decided, look, we've got to protect our gains. We don't want any competition. So these corporations passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which said you cannot compete with the big corporations. Now, they sold this to Congress. They said, look, we want to have free competition. We don't want any restraint of trade. So we're going to pass the Antitrust Act so there will be no more big trusts in the United States. Everything will be open to everybody. Anybody could start a company and do whatever they want. But actually, the Sherman Antitrust Act in operation has always been to stifle competition. That these upstart companies, like Bill Gates comes along with Microsoft, and that's why the Justice Department went after him, because this was the true spirit of antitrust, was for the Justice Department to crush Bill Gates, and the lawsuit was brought by his own competitors. They said, Bill Gates has too much of the business, so that's a sin. And of course, the Justice Department is against sin, so they went after Bill Gates. And even though he was the richest man in the world, when the Justice Department went after him, because they could fold him up like a collapsing door because they have so much power, and the Sherman Antitrust Act and all that stuff. What they were trying to do was send Bill Gates a message: you're now the richest man in the world, and you're spending $1.5 million a year in Washington? This is ridiculous. So he got the message, and he's now spending about $50 million a year. And because the criminals, they want you to share. If you're making a lot of money, they want you to share it with them. Just be nice. Don't be selfish. And so that's the whole story of the Justice Department. They want you to be nice. And they do it through taxation, and they do it through government force if that's necessary, and that's what they did. So this is the whole system which was set up in 1694 in England. And what happened was in 1688, England had what they called the Glorious Revolution. And this is part of English history, the Glorious Revolution. What was the Glorious Revolution? The Amsterdam bankers, who at that time were the richest people in the world, they controlled most of banking in the world, they were very unhappy with King James II of England. They were afraid that his daughter, who had married a Catholic, they were going to have a Catholic king of England, and they didn't want this. So, because they didn't want, see, Henry VIII had rebelled against the Catholics and taken away all their lands and created a whole new dukedom, which of the people he gave the Catholic lands to. So England had been Protestant after that time. So James II, they thought, my gosh, he's going to go back to a Catholic. So the Amsterdam bankers decided, they had a minor prince in the Netherlands called William. So they decided to finance William, who had a claim to the English throne, a very small claim. They would finance him to invade England and take it over. Well, the problem was William did not have many troops or many ships. He had by no means any amount of military force which he could take over England. So they did it the easy way. They bribed all of King James's admirals and generals to sell him out. And when King William's little flotilla appeared off the coast of England, all of King James's generals and admirals defected to William. So he almost won England without firing a shot. And the purpose of all this was they wanted to set up a central bank in England. So King William set up the Bank of England in 1694. And up to that time, England had, about every 50 years, they'd have a revolution or a war. After the Bank of England was set up, there has never been a revolution in England, because for a revolution you need some money. And once the Bank of England took over the finances of the British Empire, nobody ever had any money to object to anything, and so England has enjoyed tranquility for 300 years. It's that simple. Control the money and you control the people. So the bankers realized they needed intelligence, so they set up the first and best intelligence operation in the world called the British Secret Information Service, SIS. And the purpose of the SIS was not merely to gather intelligence, but also to control the opposition. So if there was any opposition, these intelligence operators would infiltrate it and take it over. This is laid out by a Chinese general named Sun Tzu, who said, always control the opposition. Doesn't matter what it is. It can be the Thursday morning garden club or whatever, but you send agents in and you control it. And in fact, I was very active in right-wing organizations all through the 50s and 60s. And we could always tell a government informant, because he would come in and make the biggest donation. And then he would say, look, you guys are not doing anything. Let's get something going here. Let's blow up a building. I'll get the dynamite. It won't cost you a penny. We'll take care of everything. And these guys would say, hey, this is good. We'll really get something going. So they'd blow up a building, and then they'd all go to prison for life. Because they would have so much testimony against them. When they went to court, they didn't have a chance. And of course, their lawyers would never plead entrapment or anything like that. And so these guys were on the fast track to 30 years in prison. And this is controlling the opposition, and that's how it's done. So the result is there's very little opposition because it's all infiltrated. And you can always tell the government informant, because he is the real activist. And he is the one that brings in the money. If you can't pay the rent on the hall, he pays the rent. This guy is a real patriot, you know. So anyway, to get back to Jekyll Island in 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich, the chairman of this meeting, was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. Now, what had happened with John D. Rockefeller, who was financed by the Rothschilds, by the way, so it's really a Rothschild operation. We're trained to think of the Rockefellers as terrible bandits and unscrupulous oligarchs and so forth. Well, in fact, they're nobodies. The Rockefellers are nobody today in this country, but they're a convenient whipping boy. So Rockefeller, after the Rothschilds set him up to be the biggest monopoly in the world, Standard Oil in New Jersey, they looked around for other fields, and so they put him into the medical profession. He revolutionized the medical profession in this country, converted it almost overnight from homeopathy and naturopathy to allopathic medicine. Allopathic medicine, which I describe in my book, Murder by Injection, was a German system which relied on radical surgery, lengthy hospital stays, and heavy use of drugs. When I say drugs, I mean drugs. And so they put the medical profession into the drug business. And that was a Rockefeller operation. Then they decided to use Rockefeller to create their central bank and money monopoly. So they set up the National Monetary Commission. In 1907, the bankers in New York precipitated a panic of 1907. And people lost their money and banks closed and there was economic chaos. And so obviously, then the bankers set up a public hue and cry for banking reform. You can read about it in the New York Times of that period. That they said, we must have banking reform. Well, of course, all of the devastation and depredation was caused by the bankers themselves. I mean, these people who put the money in these banks did not cause the banks to fail, and they didn't want to lose their money, but they lost their money. So banking reform. So Theodore Roosevelt set up the National Monetary Commission. And the National Monetary Commission was empowered to make recommendations for banking reform. So the members of this commission, who of course were congressmen, under Nelson Aldrich, the Republican majority leader, they traveled to Europe. They wanted to see how banks worked in Europe. So they were wined and dined by the Rothschilds in Paris and London, and they had a great time for about 2 years, but they did absolutely nothing. And so people sort of forgot about banking reform. And after they had lulled the people into a total false sense of security, then they took off and went to Jekyll Island, to the Millionaires Club, and secretly drafted their central bank plan, which they called the Aldrich Plan after Nelson Aldrich. Well, of course, the Republicans adopted the Aldrich Plan as their platform in 1912. And the banker-controlled press set up a great hue and cry against the Aldrich Plan as the Wall Street Plan, as the big bankers' plan. Then they called on Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, to offer a better plan. So Woodrow Wilson put in the Democratic platform in 1912 the Federal Reserve Plan, which he offered as the alternative to the Aldrich Plan. Now, the interesting thing was it was exactly the same as the Aldrich Plan, but nobody noticed. And so, but they couldn't elect Woodrow Wilson because he was not a very charismatic person. He was a dull professor. He was not a good speaker. He was totally unlikable. So he was born in my hometown, by the way, Stanton, Virginia. That's the only claim to fame in Stanton is that I'm from there and Woodrow Wilson was there. Nobody else ever amounted to anything. So, so they had this task of electing Woodrow Wilson in order to enact the Federal Reserve Act. But unfortunately, William Howard Taft was very well liked. He was the president running for re-election. And there was general prosperity. I mean, there was no reason for the American people to trade Taft for Woodrow Wilson. So the bankers called on an old friend, Theodore Roosevelt, who had set up the National Monetary Commission, and said, Ted, we need you to go in and splinter the Republican vote. So Ted Roosevelt comes out of nowhere, starts the Bull Moose Party, runs for president himself, splits the Republican vote. Woodrow Wilson is a shoo-in, and Taft and Roosevelt, of course, disappear. So now they could have him sign the Federal Reserve Act. But the congressmen from the Middle West and the Far West were totally opposed to even the Federal Reserve Act because they knew it was a phony. And so they were led by Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh of Minnesota. And I've been to his home at Little Falls, Minnesota, and it's a wonderful museum. This man really gave his life to fight the bankers. And of course, he was the father of the aviator. And so Lindbergh led the campaign against the Federal Reserve Act. And so Paul Warburg himself, who was the author of the act, and the other bankers had to, for the first time in their life, come down to Washington and lobby in the halls of Congress to get the Federal Reserve Act passed. And of course, they had to make a lot of promises, a lot of commitments, a lot of bribes. But since they printed the money, it didn't matter. So they bribed the Congress to enact the Federal Reserve Act, which was signed, but they still could not get a majority vote. So they had to wait till the Christmas vacation after Lindbergh and the Middle Western and Western congressmen had departed for Christmas vacation. Then they brought the Federal Reserve Act before Congress on December 23rd, after the opposition had left. But they still had a quorum, they still could pass it. And so even the New York Times said, never has legislation of such importance been passed under such circumstances. In other words, the whole Federal Reserve Act was passed through fraud. It was passed more or less while Congress was in Christmas vacation. And so Wilson signed the act into law on December 23rd, practically Christmas Eve, and it became public law. So now that they had a central bank with the power to print all the money they wanted, a privately owned bank, and the Federal Reserve Act itself is an amazing act. It's an act of total monopoly because every word in it, first of all the money that the bankers can print becomes an obligation of the U.S. government, which means the U.S. taxpayer. Second, the stockholders of this private bank included in the legislation that no Federal Reserve Bank stock could ever be bought or sold on any exchange in the world. So in other words, the initial purchasers would own it in perpetuity, which is what happened because the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Schiffs all bought the original stock in 1914 and have owned it ever since. And they've put it into foundations, so it can never be touched. And these foundations are the real government of the United States, Rockefeller Foundation. Nearly all of your major legislation in the United States is prepared by these foundations. And they submit it to Congress, and of course they have enormous staffs and billions of dollars. So they bring the legislation before Congress. And it's impeccable. It's researched and it's phrased and everything is done just right. And so of course the Congress accepts it. And they look around, they say, is anybody objected to any of this? And of course there's total silence. Nobody objects. So it becomes law. That's why you have laws constantly passed by Congress which are actively opposed by 85% of the American people. Almost everything that's done in Washington is opposed by 85% of the American people. So you have government by 15%, government by elites. And they're not even Americans. These are international elitists. They have no allegiance whatsoever to the United States, just like your Canadian legislatures have no allegiance to you. They have no allegiance to Canada. They're part of the international elite. But of course, they don't say this publicly, and the press hails them all as great patriots and dedicated people, selfless individuals. They love that word selfless. Imagine, all your legislators are selfless. They never have a selfish bone in their body because they're working for you. They want to give you things. And of course, the only purpose they have is to rob you. Not only you, but all 6 billion people in the world, because it's a government of robbery.